beats you up, which is by design, right? Because if you're going to be a person.
Thank you all for coming. Glad to be here again. Thank you, Larry, for inviting me, Beverly, for helping the promo. This is an aspect, or one chapter, actually 2 chapters, of my latest project. It's a follow-up to Curious Unions, which started in 1898 to 1961. So the follow-up book is from 1961 to 1975. And within that, I look at the Chicana movement and in Ventura County. So where the first book focused largely, not exclusively on Oxnard, the second one was looking beyond Oxnard and to places like Santa Paula, and Saticoy, Ventura, and other places. A lot of it's still centered in Oxnard, but not so much before. And the 2 chapters that I look at for today's talk has to do with the issue of school segregation, and later on, after 1971, as you said, the issue of mandatory busing as a result of a case called Soria versus Oxnard School District. And so this is a part of it. And I'm just going to go overview much of it and show you some images along the process, along the way, to make it more real in regards to maybe you recognize some people in the images. But to contextualize, let me see if we can get the first slide going. It was part of a larger movement that was taking place in the United States. That's what I try to do in my work, is bringing more national issues to the local, right? And oftentimes, Ventura County lives in the shadow of Los Angeles County, right? So I see it as part of my work to see what's happening in our backyard in relationship to Southern California and the national. Right? And one of the cases that came out, and this goes, back, I could go back even further than this, in regards to the issue of separate but equal in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. And that was overturned by the Brown decision, Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, that declared it unconstitutional to segregate, particularly in the schools. But even before that, there was a case in California that's often overlooked, is Mendez versus Westminster, in which the Mendez family, and as the lead plaintiffs, sued because their daughter and sons were denied entry into a predominantly white school. One of the aspects of this is that they had cousins that had been admitted into the Westminster school, but they were light-skinned Mexicans, right? And they had a French-sounding name, right? So as a result of being, having a more French-sounding name, and also being light-complected, they were allowed in, and they were being enrolled in the same day by their aunt, right? The Mendez family was being, the Mendez kids were being enrolled by their aunt because their parents were working, right? And the aunt took all the children from the school and explained it to her brother. And he couldn't believe it. He said, "This must be some mistake," right? But it was no mistake, right? And as a result of that, he sued. And he had the economic means to sue because he was also a farmer. He was working a farm of a family who had been interned during World War II. And just like here in Oxnard, that happened with the Takasugi family, right? And the Carmonas took over the farm, or actually the market, as when they were interned. So he was making good money as a farmer during the war economy, That's an important aspect, because to sue somebody takes money, it takes a wherewithal. If you don't have the money, you can't fight really illegally. Ultimately, it was declared that it was unconstitutional in regards to California state law, right? But it still applied to African Americans and also Native American Indians in terms of segregation, right? So, because it even gets more complicated in regards to how people of Mexican ancestry were labeled, right? They were labeled as Caucasian, right? So there was wiggle room in terms of allowing them in. And 9 years later, we have the Brown decision, right? And the civil rights movement emerges. And people assume sometimes that just because you have a decision that all is well now, right? But no, there was, as we know, there was a lot of resistance going on, not only in Southern California, but throughout the nation in regards to segregation. Then there was Brown 2 that came later in terms of determining all deliberate speed, because a lot of school districts, a lot of states were really dragging their feet implementing desegregation in the schools. And this is where the Oxnard School District comes into play too. I mean, it was, many of the schools were segregated in Oxnard. Sometimes we look at segregation as a phenomena of the South, right? But segregation was throughout the United States, particularly in places like Oxnard and Los Angeles. That doesn't really, because usually when we talk about race and racism, it takes a white, black, perspective, right? Not looking at how it affected Asian Americans, for example, and Hispanic Americans in different groups, different countries. And this is how it played out in Ventura County. So this was, and that's that. And the schools were actually named Mexican schools, right? You're going to the Mexican school. It was so normalized, right, that was part of the language that was utilized. And you'll see, predominantly classrooms and schools that were defined by race, and you would have a counterpart of that. And they were called American schools, right? So to be white was to be American, and to be non-white, you were not considered American in that regard. So that's an Orange County image, and
that's a Mexican school?
That's a Mexican school, Mexican classroom. Right? Then when there weren't schools, you would have schools within schools, right? And we're going to get that too, where that white children had special classes within the school, and they were separated from Mexican children, right? And it gets so technical in regards. They even had different schedules in terms of when the school started and when school ended, and when recesses were, so that children would not intermingle in the same school, right? So this is one of the forces that takes place. This is kind of small. I shot this just this morning from Google Maps, right? And I'll point it out. And the area of Oxnard that was segregated was La Colonia, right? And here is the Ramona School that was, I think, 1938 was established. Then a little bit afterwards, about 8 years later, we have what is now called Cesar Chavez School. But it's Juanita School. It was called Juanita School because it's off of Juanita Street, right? So now, and the reason why it's now called Cesar Chavez, because the famous labor organizer, farm worker Cesar Chavez, often spoke at the Juanita School, right? That was the go-to place every time. So that's the reason behind it being renamed there. And so this is at Ramona School right there. If you had a strong arm, you could throw a rock and hit the Juanita School, right? So that's how segregation worked. Instead of spacing out the schools, that would allow for for non-Mexicans to attend the school. They put it right in the heart of La Colonia, where it would specifically serve students of Mexican ancestry who were United States citizens, many times the sons and daughters of United States citizens, right, if not grandchildren of United States citizens, along with more recent immigrant children, right, living in La Colonia. So that's, and then right here you have the Rose Avenue School, which is about doing the Google Maps, it's 1.3 miles away. It's walking distance away, right? So you're having, 3 elementary schools all within a close radius, right? Then another aspect down the street from Cesar Chavez or Juanita is a more private school in the Guadalupe Church school, right? So you have 4 elementary schools all right there. Then Oxnard Boulevard is where, this is the border, right? In terms of this is the west side of Oxnard, predominantly up until the 1970s. Was where most of the white community lived, right, with a few minorities. It gets more complicated if you look at South Oxnard versus North Oxnard, which is basically 5th Street, right? Anything north of 5th Street is considered to be North Oxnard, right? So in the 1960s, the Oxnard Elementary School Board wanted to build another a middle school, right? They wanted to build a middle school in La Colonia, right? Because you have all these elementary schools, now you have to have a middle school. And before that, they used to go to the Wilson School, which is on the west side, off of Palm and C Street, right?
Across the border.
Across the border, and that's where children went, right? And that was an integrated school, but in the sense that you also had a school within a school. In terms of the dynamic that I just explained in regards, classrooms were segregated. You had different schedules for predominantly white students and also students of Mexican ancestry and African American students, Asian. It was planned, right? But it also became impacted. I'll take messages at the end so I could get through it. And so hold that message, right, that question. So they wanted to build a middle school in La Colonia, right? And let's see where I'm at with the. I'm trying to coordinate with groups of people and organizations. In 1958-59, Cesar Chavez created the Community Service Organization. And they addressed the Bracero program in terms of imported Mexican labor, right? And the reason for that was to bring male laborers. I mean, this is another component of it. The agriculture industry wants workers, but they don't want their families, right? Because families have children. And then families have children that need to be educated, right? And then they also have to be serviced in other ways, right? And so the Bracero program was the idea to have workers but not have no responsibility for them. So once you have the worker complete their job, you just have them go return to Mexico, right? And so you had domestic workers being pitted against imported Mexican workers because also imported Mexican workers depressed the wage rate, right? And that was Cesar Chavez's that was his goal, was to get jobs for domestic farm workers over that of imported. So, but before that, he organized voting campaigns, right? The CSO, registered voters in La Colonia, and after he completes his mission, if you will, of registering voters, citizenship, voting, then then he also wins the battle against Braceros, against the farmers. It wasn't really the Braceros themselves that he was opposed to. It was the exploitation that the growers were embarked upon of the imported labor, right? Because with non-citizen workers, they don't have that protection, right? You know, working hours, health, we're talking about insurance, right? Worker safety. For immigrant workers, there's little responsibility, and especially as they would utilize labor contractors. So the farm worker, the farm owner washed their hands by saying, I don't hire farm workers, I hire a labor contractor, right? They're the ones responsible for all that, not me. So they win temporarily. But the organization, the community service organization remains, right? So they will service the community in La Colonia and Greater Oxnard. It'll be later called the Ventura County CSO, Community Service Organization. So it wasn't just limited to Oxnard, and that's John Soria. There's an elementary school named after him now, right? It's the John Soria School off of Fifth Street, actually, by the airport. And he was a major proponent, civically engaged resident who was active in the CSO with Cesar Chavez. Actually, he was Cesar Chavez's assistant. And to fast forward in the talk, his brother's children would be the lead plaintiffs in the Soria versus Oxnard School District lawsuit. And that's him right there at the CSO office. He also established the Mexican American Political Association, which was more politics-oriented, voter-oriented, rather than service-oriented, or service in the community. Right? So the CSO is a major organization of Ventura County, specifically Oxnard, that raises the issue of segregation in 1963. Right, in terms of, well, why another school here, right? Or why we want a more integrated school. So the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also opposed the school in La Colonia. And if let me just back up a bit here. The school was proposed to be built right here off of Rose Avenue and Camino del Sol, right? So you already have Cesar Chavez and also Ramona and Rose Avenue, and they went to middle school right here, again, in the heart. And it was obvious to them what was going on, right? Another school in La Colonia that's going to segregate our children from the rest of the community, right? And La Colonia was an area in which African Americans also lived, right? And many of them also lived in South Oxnard. And they worked for the naval bases here, right? Many of them worked for the U.S. Post Office. So again, economic means. They had the money to participate in civically, right? So even though they didn't work together, they worked, parallel together in terms of opposing the middle school in La Colonia in 1963. So it doesn't, the issue, it's 9 years from Brown versus Board of Education, right? So there's still that recent aspect of, the civil rights movement that's going on here. So there, and the person right here you might recognize, well, there's John Flynn. There's Fred Jones, who was also president of the NAACP. Bert Hammond was a high school teacher in Oxnard and Hueneme for a long time. He went to Ohio State University. He was a product of Jesse Owens. And Jan Al Duff, who was also his wife, Mexi, was also a teacher in the Oxnard School District. They still live in Oxnard. Jan Kelsey, Assemblyman Mervyn Demley, and I forgot, I cut off her name. Oh, May Davis. May Davis. So the point is that the organizations were going to the Oxnard School District board meetings, and they were challenging. They were successful. They were successful in stopping the building of that middle school, right? And charging them with discrimination, right? And segregation. So, and what's happening is that the segregation is being defined as de facto, right? It's unofficial, right? It's kind of, this is the way things are, right? It's not intentional. It just happens, right? And that's the way the Oxnard School District was responding to all this. That we're not racially inclined. We're not racist, but just the way it just happens, right? I think it's the next slide which details this. So that we have the de facto and the de jure. The de jure is being with intent. Right? It is by policy. It is by law that segregation takes place or discrimination takes place. And usually when people talk about de facto segregation, discrimination, racism, or de jure, it's often brought up as though they're separate and exclusive from each other. In actuality, they complement each other, right? One reinforces the other, one stems from the other. And that's one of the outcomes of the case is where it's discovered that the de facto of custom, unofficial, is actually a product of the de jure. And this is in regards to school segregation. This is a deed of a home, right? It's called a restricted real estate covenant, right? Oh. And this was common throughout the United States. It's not just Mississippi, right? It's in Oxnard, right? It's in Ventura. It's in Santa Paula, right? Where white neighborhood homes often had these clauses in their deeds, and one was a racial covenant. And this one says, no person of any race other than the white or Caucasian race, nor any Mexican, Indian, or East Indian, or any person who is of lineal descent. So it's not just a person who is an immigrant, right? It's the offspring too, right? Or the first or second degree of a person born in the Republic of Mexico shall use or occupy any building or any parcel, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy of by domestic workers of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. Right? So it's fine, long as you were a servant, right, of color, but you couldn't rent or own that home. So this is the de jure in terms of housing discrimination. And this is why up until the 1970s, Oxnard was largely defined in terms of northwest Oxnard was predominantly white neighborhoods, and South Oxnard was more working class, more integrated, because there was a newer developments there, right? But the schools, the boundaries, follow housing patterns, right? So if you have a segregated neighborhood and you have neighborhood schools, the schools are going to be segregated. And this is one argument that the Oxnard School District trustees were making, is that this is not intentional, this is just the way builders and the city of Oxnard have zoned areas. And what happens is there's a book by Professor David Garcia, and it's a new book. It's like it's 2018, I believe. It's called Strategies of Segregation, right? And he looks at, this is a deed in which he found, along with his partner, Barajas, they found it at the Ventura County records, right? They went into the deeds, and they have many, many deeds. And what they find out in these deeds, many of the school board officials, the trustees, the Ventura County superintendent of schools, they own property with these deeds, right? And they knew that these clauses were there, right? So the whole idea is, well, do you think they just stopped with their home ownership, or did they utilize their power as school officials to also segregate schools, right? So this is something that we have to look at carefully, because oftentimes people will say, well, I have no part of it, it's just the way it is. But it was systematic. It was officially designed in regards to segregation of schools, because of the neighborhoods were segregated. And what happens, the case of Soria versus Oxnard School District goes before Judge Harry Pregerson, who passed away this past year. He was 89, 90 years old. It went before him, and in May of 1971, he issued a summary judgment to desegregate the schools. He told the Oxnard School District that it doesn't matter whether it's de jure or de facto. You can't use that You can't use that excuse. The fact that the schools are segregated is reason enough under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, in terms of equal protection under the law, that schools need to be desegregated. The Oxnard School District did not accept that, right? They said, well, we had no fault on it, right? So they appeal the case, right? Even though the judgment moves forward and busing order is implemented in September of 1971, they appeal the case, right? And that's why the whole issue of to bus or not to bus is the part of it. Because the Oxnard School District also wanted to stop the busing order, to put a stay on it while it was being appealed. Right? And they'll take it to the various levels of the federal court system. They ultimately lose the idea of staying, stopping the busing, but they still want to appeal it. Steve will say he was facing busing, right? And I was bused from South Oxnard to the Bertel School. Now it's like a convent for nuns off of C Street. Yeah, off of C Street and G. I forgot what the border line is. Maybe Doris, that area there. For 1 year. I don't know why it was just 1 year. I was bused for 1 year. Then the next year I went back to Driftwell Elementary, right? Which is more. It was a more integrated school, right? But what a lot of people did to avoid busing was to enroll in private schools. Private schools or Catholic schools, right? And other people, particularly one member of the school district, his name was J. Keith Mason, who was a doctor. He was my physician, actually. He was my family doctor. They ended up moving out of Oxnard. So that's the next level of study, right from here is how did Oxnard become largely a Hispanic, Latino, Mexican-American origin community, right? And I would argue, if you look at the studies, it all came from busing, right? As busing was implemented, there was a white flight that took place afterwards. And I brought this up in another forum like this, and I said, well, I haven't studied it. I can't say for sure, but it's my sense this is what happened. And somebody in the background, a white woman, a mother whose daughter I went to high school with, she says, absolutely, that people were selling their homes, and moving to Camarillo. They were moving to Ventura. They were moving to other places rather than Oxnard to avoid busing, because people in North Oxnard, their children would be bused to La Colonia. They were being bused to Ramona. They were being bused. And even Mexican-American residents who had gone to college, they were moving on up, right? They moved into North Oxnard.
Yeah.
One is Gil Cuevas. He just passed away, and I interviewed him. I went to school with his daughter too, Debbie. And he was a high school counselor at Hueneme High School, Oxnard High School. They lived off of H Street. H Street, I forgot what the street was, but North Oxnard. And his daughter was bused to La Colonia. And so that was kind of ironic of it, right? That even Mexican Americans who were trying to be integrated were being also part of the busing to Mexican schools. So that's part of the irony of history. History looks at these contradictions that happen, right? And so what happens? And the League of Women Voters somehow discovered in the Oxnard School District archives minutes. They found minutes of 1936 and 1938 where it detailed the school board intentionally designed schools by the pressure of white residents to separate Mexican students from white students. Right? They did gymnastics, mental gymnastics, and also bureaucratic gymnastics to have schools within schools, and also separate schools in the Oxnard School District. Right? This is 1936-38. So how does it play out in 1963 and later 1970-71? Well, this is part of the culture that's being developed. It's also part of the system that's carried on. That's complicated by real estate. Agents did the same thing. They wouldn't show homes to people of color, right? And also lending institutions, banks, they would not lend money, or at least the amount of money to people of color, families, to live in white neighborhoods, right? Then there are neighborhood councils. If a family, African-American family, Mexican-American family, or Asian, if they were going to move into a neighborhood, they were pressured not to buy that home, right? Also the owners were pressured not to sell the home to people of color. They called it blockbusting, right? Don't break the block, right, in terms of neighborhood block. Then you also had Federal Housing Authority redlining, right, in terms of low-income housing and also middle-class housing. So everything's separate, right? Then there's a correlation between race and income, right? Because even employment was segregated, right? There was in the shade work and out of the shade work, right? Based on skin color, right? Based on race, and also income. So if you worked out, if you were denied higher positions of employment, you couldn't afford a middle-class home. So my point of bringing this up is that you're seeing the de jure and the de facto playing out together over time in affecting schooling. And the League of Women Voters gets a hold of these minutes, and it's brought up into Oxnard School District meeting, right? Because many white residents were saying, we don't have racism, we don't have segregation. This is all just part of the de facto. And it's in an Oxnard Press Courier report. Just as somebody said that, somebody came out with the pamphlet of the League of Women Voters. I thought it was explosive, but you really don't hear anything about it anymore. This is August of 1971, and the newspapers don't report the minutes anymore. It's like, I would think that this would be a central point of discussion. So it's silent. It doesn't emerge until the Oxnard School District went into appeal, right? And they demanded a trial, because the first case was a summary judgment. The judges saw the evidence, was presented, said, well, based on this evidence, desegregate, right? But the Oxnard School District wanted a full-blown trial, where you have discovery, and you have, where you have a cross-examination, you have witnesses, full-blown. The Oxnard School District should have just stopped there, right? But when they went into appeal, in which the Federal Court of Appeals ordered Pragerson to have a full trial, everything came out, right? And part of it was the school district minutes, right? And not only that, they brought in witnesses, former superintendents of the Oxnard School District. And they themselves would admit, yes, we purposely segregated students. And we tried to desegregate. We tried to desegregate in the 1960s, the mid-1960s, and up until 1969, 1970, but the school board would have none of it. Right? The NAACP brought desegregation plans, like 9 different ways of doing it, right? The California Department of Education, Intergroup Relations, brought their own consultant and said, this is the way you do it if you want to desegregate. They had nothing of it, right? So the school district up until the late 1960s and the early 70s were stonewalling segregation. Right? So that's, and I'll just kind of go more quickly and just kind of, these are newspaper accounts showing you that's Eddie London, who was the president of the NAACP at the time. They threatened marches to protest.
Wasn't there a riot around that time too in Colombia?
That was 1970, 71. You're right. There were 2 of them. there were riots in La Colonia, and this is the milieu of the time, right? This is the environment. There was a lot of tension going on. The Oxnard High School administration building would be bombed on a Sunday night, right? Yeah, a political bombing. Nobody was hurt. They purposely did it at night and a Sunday, but if they were protesting the tensions in the high schools in addition to riots. Then there's, you would have school board meetings that were jammed, from both sides, those that wanted desegregation to move forward and those who were opposing busing. And this is one of my local heroes here is Bill Terry, who still goes to the Oxnard School, goes to the board meetings of the city council in Oxnard. Right? Him and his wife, they always sit in the front row, and they work every Saturday. They're right in Saturday in a community garden, Alpha Gonzalez Road in Patterson. Right? And he's there protesting the opponents of busing. Right? But another twist to this, there were Mexican Americans and African Americans who opposed busing too.
Yes, yes.
They said, we don't want to have, because it's inconvenient, right? It's like, oh, you got a busing, there's no after school programs and so forth. Child gets sick, right? And so forth. Things come up, right? So there were many activists who didn't want busing too, but what really angered them was initially the school board was for one-way busing, meaning people like Colonia would be bused to the white neighborhoods, but the white neighborhood families would not be inconvenienced by busing. That's what they opposed. Right? If we're going to have busing, everybody has to experience it one way or another. Right? It's not just one constituency of the community. Right? They also believe that integration in itself didn't mean quality education. They want quality of resources. They wanted good, well-funded schools. They wanted all the good. They wanted good teachers. Many times the problematic teachers were transferred into the La Colonia schools.
Or the beginning teachers.
Or the beginning teachers, the inexperienced teachers, right? So there are all these nuances to the issue of the busing. Right? And that's the Association of Mexican American Educators. Again, one of the leaders of that was Gil Cuevas and others. Joe Mendoza was also a member. He's still part of Migrant Ed today.
Where's this located?
This was I want to say that it was off Colonial Road, if not Cooper Road. See, I always mix those two up in terms of where places we're at, right? Let me go back, and one person I skipped over. This was Rachel Murguia Wong, and she got elected to the school board, and she worked for the Oxnard School District, and she saw from the inside in how minority school children were being disadvantaged in terms of resources and teachers and curriculum. Their story wasn't being told in the classroom, right? So she would be the champion, ultimately, and the voice of the Mexican American community on the school board. And she was always battling, particularly the trustee president, Keith Mason, right? Because he was strongly opposed to busing. He was for voluntary busing, but that doesn't work, right? I mean, if you have the choice to go bus or not bus, you probably say, I'm not going to bus, right? It's more convenient just to have my child here, right? So, and she was a graduate of UCLA. She went back to school and got her Chicano Studies degree at San Fernando Valley State. And she would bring in professors from San Fernando Valley State to in-service teachers, give them sensitivity in terms of curriculum and their history and social studies, right? And the reason why I back up and go back to the Association of Mexican American Educators, they're the ones that came to her defense when she was being attacked by the community. And they wanted to recall her too. They wanted to recall her because she was for the desegregation order. And so the importance of having organizational support, right, in addition to your own network of friends and family. Right, so ultimately, busing would be preserved, right, and over time, Oxnard becomes so integrated that there's no need for it anymore. So. And there was a trial, and that's when Pragerson and the lawyers for the plaintiffs, Soria, they brought the school district minutes, brought in the witnesses, superintendents, and it all came out that it was de jure intentional segregation. And even the school district was planning to appeal that, right? And they said, ultimately they just accepted the decision and implemented it. The order, right? So that's my presentation. You had a question, sir, earlier.
Yeah, when you were talking about the Wilson School,
yeah.
I attended Wilson School to the 7th and 8th grade. It's true, the classes were segregated. We had separate lunch hours, separate recesses. And by the way, John Soria was a fellow classmate.
Is that right?
You know what?
Just pick up on that. Your name?
Barajas, Carlos.
Carlos Magallanes. I want to get your phone number later. Because these are untold stories, right? And even Joe Mendoza would say that, the playgrounds were segregated, right?
Went to school with Joe Mendoza also.
Okay, there you go. So, and the bathrooms were on the white segregated side, and he said, what did you do, right? And he said, we had to go to, where the trees were at, right? And that's how bad it was.
When you mentioned Oxnard Boulevard, we used to refer to it as across the tracks.
Across the tracks, yeah. And that was a dangerous area to cross because of the trains, right? And if that's a busy traffic area.
So, sitting here, I'm completely conflicted. It's because my dad, his office was in Colombia. It's his best friend right there. And my dad came from LA, and we moved to the north side of Oxnard. And no sooner did we move to Pamela Street than this started. And I remember my dad saying, hey, you're not going to go to that school, I'm waiting for so I think the community was already changing, breaking out of the border, so to speak. And then that happened, so I went to Hueneme Christian. So then, later on, we moved to Camarillo, and a very nice area in Camarillo. And people were looking at us. We were like the first Mexican family in this predominantly white area. So then I went to Mason Union School, and I riding the bus to school and we'd pick up the immigrant farm workers from the farms out there, and you'd hear all the time those Mexicans. So yeah, it was really strange, awkward for me growing up, just to say the least. And hearing all this just kind of like conflicts me.
Sure. Yeah. And there was, you know, crossing over from the south side of Fifth Street to the north side of Fifth Street. That was kind of, you understood that there was a different area of town you were entering, right? And it was real. It was real. Oxnard was a sundown town. A sundown town is when people of color, particularly African Americans, would work as domestic servants for whites, but at the end of the workday, when sundown was approaching, there could be no longer people of color in white neighborhoods. The police would go and make sure to find out what they were doing. And in speaking to residents, they detail this in terms of, yeah, so we were in North Oxnard at a certain time, police would immediately contact us, right, in terms of what we were doing there and all sorts of things. Yes?
I have several questions, sorry. First of all, La Colonia, how was it originally developed? Was it specifically for farm workers and immigrants, or was it developed differently?
Yeah, originally it was one of the main parts of Oxnard, right? But over time, it would be defined as an immigrant community, particularly lower working class community, farm worker community, early on in the 20th century. But in the beginning, that was a stop-off point for everyone, right? But then as time progresses, like you said, going other side of the tracks, right? That was the white neighborhoods. And many of the schools are named after managers and real estate developers, like Driffle Elementary.
Yeah.
Driffle was one of the managers of the American Beet Sugar Company factory, which is the largest sugar beet refining factory in the United States. Right. So, and there would be other areas, other schools named after developers, and you know, people have money, right? Carlos?
The streets of Colonia are named after presidents.
Yeah.
Domestic presidents.
Garfield, Roosevelt, McKinley. I guess that was a way to Americanize immigrants, right? Name them after schools and you'll know your presidents, right?
President Cooper.
Yeah, then there will be others that will be named after landowners. Right? And La Colonia was the land grant of the Gonzalez family early on in the 19th century. So they had a longer name, but ultimately La Colonia.
Was Asian Americans affected similarly in a community like this?
Ultimately, and that's a good question, Mexicans and Asians, particularly Japanese and Chinese, came at the same time, and Filipinos, right? Good point. But early in the 20th century, Asians will largely be excluded from coming to the United States. So there'll be a small number, and you know, numbers matter. A smaller number of Japanese Americans is not as threatening to many people. So if you'll tolerate, you know, maybe 5 or 6 out of 1,000. But if 50% of the community is becoming Mexican, right? That's when you have, and that's what's at the heart of what we're living through right now. The United States is going through a demographic change, right? And there are some that the demographic shift that we're going through. We went through what we're seeing nationally. We went through in the 1990s in California already with Propositions 187, 227, and 209. So, you know, that was our expiation back then. But now nationally, what we experienced in California in the 1990s, the nation is facing right now. Right? So,
yeah, when was the case finally settled, and what level of appeal did it get to?
yeah, good question. It was 1973 in November. It was a trial was held for, I think it was like less than a week, and it stopped there. And it went back to the Second District federal court. And that was Judge Harry Pregerson, right?
Right.
So even though they appealed the case, it went back to him, right? And even the district's the trustees felt, at the end, they still felt they didn't get a good trial, even though all the evidence pointed against them. Right? Diana?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on, you know, you had mentioned like resources and the differences in resources between segregated and segregated schools and the quality of teachers and the experience of the teachers. And I just, you know, wanted to kind of highlight the significance of that, or how strongly that impacted the development and education of the kids that were in, the Mexican students.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm speaking in terms of what happened in Santa Paula, you know, with my own parents. My father talks about growing up in segregated schools in Santa Paula, and they'd have books, broken pencils, you know, yeah, I mean, he just said they just weren't taught anything, you know, and the teachers would remind them, and we had a couple of memories that really stand out about teachers who would say, you're lucky we're teaching you, nobody wants to teach you, your parents are lazy, that sort of thing. So, but what happened was that then when they finally went into a segregated environment, which was at the high school, the Mexican-American students were so disadvantaged. He said he just felt like an idiot. You know, he just felt so lost and so angry that, you know, the difference, right, in the education that they had received was so indisputable.
Yeah.
And he dropped out, and there probably, I would imagine, a lot of students that dropped out. Thankfully for me, he's self-educated and did very well, you know, in life. But that disadvantage, and then the other disadvantage is because of the poor quality of education. A lot of you didn't see Mexican Americans in college. I mean, Rachel Wong went to college. She was probably one of a handful, you know, that were at
Sure.
San Fernando State College. And then you have the Vietnam War coming along. Well, the Latino or the Mexican American students, there's no way they're going to get college deferments. They're all going to, you know, to the war. So it had so many ramifications, you know, that the quality, so that the issue is just, you know, tremendous. I mean, everybody has to go through the school district, and it really affects your quality of life, you know, as you go along.
Sure.
So,
And it's intergenerational too.
and it's intergenerational. Yeah.
And there's another person that David Garcia and I interviewed, and she was one of my students at Cal State Channel Islands. Her name is Antonio Anguillas Dilerio. And she details a similar experience. She got, you know, straight A's in La Colonia schools, right? And she thought she was a smart student. And then she hits high school, and she realizes the inferior education that she got in La Colonia schools in comparison to her white counterparts who lived on the other side of the tracks, right? And she went, like your father went to, similar to your father, went to Oxnard College and self-educated herself, and ultimately got her BA degree at Cal State Channel Islands. Right? So, but part of it was, you know, knowing that they had been wrong, right? That you know, I'm not going to accept this, right? And also demanding of their children that you're going to go to college because I was denied. Right? So it does have this intergenerational impact on families, right? Yes?
Any questions you are going to answer as you keep continuing your research in this area? Any questions you're going to concentrate?
I've thought about looking at the issue of the middle-class flight from Oxnard.
Yeah.
Right, and seeing, and I don't know how I would do that at this point, or maybe just suggesting to a sociologist, or you know, that, I don't know, I want to do that. I got other things I want to pursue, but that's a major part of it. I mean, you know, Oxnard is a predominantly minority community, you know, and the euphemism is that we're diverse, right? We're not, well, some parts of Oxnard are not really diverse, right? They're predominantly Latino origins, right? That's not diversity, right? And then you just see down the road, like Camarillo, Ventura, that, or even Thousand Oaks, you know, the demographics is the mirror opposite, right? And what's funny, what's interesting, you talk to people in Camarillo, that you're detailing. There's also people that they see a migration from Oxnard to Camarillo. Now they're transferring their students to Newbury Park High School.
Yeah.
Right, so it's like they're hopscotching, and it's still being played out, right, as a result of that. And I have a friend who lives in Woodland Hills, and just because there's a higher number, like, 2 or 3% more minorities, there are families there that say, wow, we got to move to another school district because they have higher test scores over there, right? So history, one of the things about history, we see change, but there's always these continuities that take place, right?
Good morning.
Yeah, the more history changes, you heard the same, it stays the same, right? It's not the same, but we see these echoes and rhymes of the past. And nationally, we're living another echo of the past in regards to politics. We can get one person that's from you.
Yeah, I have a house in South Oxnard near Oxnard College. I noticed the only neighbors I have that are white are ex-military, right? Yeah, retired. Did the military have much role in desegregating Oxnard? You know, with their housing, did they play any role in that?
That's a good question. The NAACP of Ventura County did confront the leadership of the naval bases, because even the the Navy housing was segregated. It was, and also not only the segregation on the bases, but also the houses that personnel lived off of, apartment complexes. Homeowners were not renting to black servicemen and their families. And this became a major issue. All right, so the NAACP of Ventura County was having these conversations with the commanders of the bases and saying something has to be done, right? Because this is part of a larger civil rights environment, right? That stemmed largely from the 1950s but carries on into the 60s. And teachers that were being recruited from the Oxnard School District from places like Indiana. And I interviewed my first grade teacher, Mrs. Walker, who came from Ball State University and was recruited. And she said, yeah, we came to Oxnard and I got recruited about my husband. We couldn't find any place to live. They wouldn't rent to us. You know, I'd make the phone call, the classic story, right? Make the phone call, you got an opening? Yeah, we got an opening. And we get there, they see who you are. Oh, sorry, we just rented it, 5 minutes ago, right? That was a common barrier, particularly for the black community in Oxnard. So you have South Oxnard, I guess the question was brought up by Beverly. What's another question? Maybe looking at South Oxnard's development after 1950 and 60, because I was driving down Ventura Road and seeing Teakwoods and all Jackson Street and all that. This was a predominantly white working class neighborhood. I remember that, right? And now it's predominantly changed from that. So yeah, the basis is another question to look into. We can Steve get a new question.
Hey, I grew up in Fort Hueneme, and my dad was stationed at the naval base. And I remember in grade school when they were talking about busing us, my dad moved on base so they couldn't bus us.
Yeah, so the base had its own school?
Yeah.
It seems like
Well, it did then. I don't know if it does now. I'm assuming it does.
the recent move by the city of Oxnard to go to districts seems
Yeah.
to be a part of this whole discussion we're having now,
Santa Paula did too.
because you had the whole city council living in this little neighborhood over here, and every time I drive down Hueneme Road and I see South Oxnard, I'm like, what is going on? You get no love on this side of town,
That's right.
But, so, my point is that these changes are still working themselves out to positive change.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah, I grew up in South Oxnard and lived there over 60 years. When my parents first moved in, middle-class residents, all white. One black family moved in on the block and everybody put up their signs for sale. They all migrated to North Oxnard, okay? That persisted for a while, and then Vietnam came along, and the veterans, like I say, from the war bought houses and was there. After the war, then the Spanish people started buying up all the houses, and it's made a real transition to where it used to be single-family homes with usually 2 kids and then 1 car or something, and now it's grown into, the Latino area has grown into maybe 20 people, 15 people in a house, and they made additions onto the houses, double stories, 2 stories, and they didn't do anything, the city didn't do anything about the parking situation. So now the streets are so crammed with cars, you can't even almost find a place to park. But it's made a big transition for different reasons and things.
The housing is so expensive.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And there's no, and that's another aspect of all this. And that's, it also, this issue came up in the course of the desegregation question. Was the schools are segregated because housing is segregated. And another contradiction was the people opposed to busing were criticizing the city council because they weren't building affordable housing in the northern areas. All the low-income housing, the projects was going into La Colonia. And it said, well, if you would have had affordable housing dispersed throughout the city, right, we would have integrated schools, right? So all these different forces in terms, because of the NIMBY movement, not in my backyard, and we see this today in regards to affordable housing. We're not talking about low-income housing. We're talking about affordable housing for like teachers, right? And for people that work for the county, right? Just the affordable housing is strongly opposed. Particularly, I don't want to beat up on Camarillo, but you read the newspaper, Camarillo is always opposed to affordable housing. And that's much less farm worker housing, right? Where's most of the farm worker housing is predominantly in Oxnard or in Santa Paula, right? Because communities like Thousand Oaks or Camarillo, Newbury Park, they don't want farm worker housing for the reasons that people say, well, they're poor people. We don't want them in our backyard.
I'm wondering if Ventura, the reason why Ventura did do the same thing, have the same problems as Oxnard, because they were really in an oil field development kind of worker stage versus agricultural farm worker type. Do you think that was the reason?
Many of the communities of Ventura County had similar issues. I haven't focused into Ventura, but that would be another because Saricoy, right, is predominantly Mexican community, right? Then you have the Avenue in terms of Ventura, right? And what happens with the Oxnard case, places like Santa Paula and Moore Park and Ventura, they said, well, we better start desegregating before we get sued too. So it doesn't make the news because there was more proactive action being taken place due to what was happening in places like in Pasadena and also in Compton, in Los Angeles, and in Oxnard, right? Because these issues of busing and desegregation were throughout Southern California. Yeah. Right, so, but another historian or another academic, you'll probably find a similar story if you look into Ventura.
They primarily had oil field operations.
There's a lot of agriculture in Ventura too.
Of agricultural.
There's a lot of orchards in Ventura. There's a lot of right, so much of Ventura County was agricultural, at that time, particularly at that time, more so than now. Right? So there were similar dynamics. Well, thank you very much.